Oop, I heard the voice. Well, it's 7:30. Welcome, everyone. Happy Monday. I just got back from last night. We were down in Florida for a few days, and I love hanging out down in Florida. It was nice, although we had rain one day. So, and then I get back, and I get back. We went last night, so I'm prepping, finishing up my presentation today, and working on it. And I can't find my Bible. So we just talked last week about finding that book. Remember? So I need to pray. All of you need to help me pray that I find my Bible. So I've looked in my cars, actually two different cars, and my work, where I have an office, and my home, and upstairs and downstairs, and all around here. Although I didn't have it, I don't think I had it last Monday here either. So, but I did have it Tuesday morning at my Bible study, and it's gone. You know how many notes I have in my Bible?
You can check lost and found.
I haven't checked lost and found yet. So I'm not going to call it lost quite yet, right? Because God knows where it is. Remember my story last week on this book. So let's pray and get going. Administratively, tonight we are going to pretend we're back in high school biology class. All right. So we are going to cover a whole bunch of stuff about evolution this week, because it's one of the biggest lies of the world, I would say. And and then we'll end with whether or not it matters or not, but I think you'll find that absolutely it does matter. So this is one of the most fascinating kind of information-based, scientific-based lessons that I have. I love this, and I hope that you don't need a whole lot of biology background to understand the concepts that we're going to talk about tonight, but I think you're going to find it fascinating. Also, we got about several videos tonight that are also amazing videos from a couple of documentary series that I love, that are very informative as well. So let's pray and we'll get going here. So, Father, first, we know that you are the God who knows all things. So I ask that you help me find my Bible with all my notes in it. And I don't know where I said it, Lord. I had it last Tuesday, and I don't know where it is. So I just ask that you help me find that. And Lord, we thank you for this class, for this church, for this room, for the technology that worked. It's working tonight perfectly. So we just pray for all the technology. And we just pray, Lord, that we continue to study you as creator of all things and the giver of life. Lord, we love you with all of our heart and soul and strength and mind. And we put our faith in you this day. In your name, in Jesus' name. Amen. So, you remember last week is, where'd Brian go?
Are you recording?
I am recording. I started it. So, there's Brian. So I showed up. I told the story last week when I showed up and there's no technology here. And I told him that you had been helping me set it up. And I said, yeah. And I called Brian and he said, well, I'm not going to make it tonight, but I'll pray for you. And everybody kind of laughed. And then I called the tech guy and he said, well, I'll send somebody. But then I kind of commented, all right, which was more important in the end? A quick prayer, and Brian prayed with me over the phone right then and there, and all the technology got set up. And I did remember to hit record last week, but if you saw online, I posted lesson 8, last week's lesson, and it wasn't from the Zoom recording. Why? Because when you stop recording and you end the Zoom session, it has to take about an hour and a half to render it and save it. And the program blew up and I lost the whole recording. So when I was down in Florida, I recorded it again. And so it's online. So lessons 8 is online. And you know what? It's working out, because in the software that I'm doing the recording at home, it actually looks a little better online anyway. So it worked out. So we'll see what happens this week. I've got my recording going. The Zoom people are there. Hi, Zoom people. Got about a dozen people online tonight. So anyway, yeah. So lesson 8. Now my remote. Yeah, review of lesson 8. And then how do I get my remote? There. So last week in lesson 8, I introduced this concept of what is called the Hydroplate Theory. And Dr. Brown had this theory, kind of a comprehensive theory about how the flood potentially happened. And I think he mentioned 25 different factors that could be predicted using his theory that all seem to come true according to his theory. I think it's the best description of what happened that day in Noah's flood, where the waters of the deep burst open, rips the seam of the earth apart, splits the continent apart, and explains meteors and the mountain ranges and on and on. The Grand Canyon, and if you remember the video, it just explains so much. And it seems to me to be the best model of what that flood probably looked like. We then started to look at all the things after the flood. So the floodgates in Genesis 8 and 9 are said to be closed. Noah and his family come out of the ark. Now animals are going to fear men, because God also says, I've given you now these animals to eat. And Grandpa Noah comes out and he repopulates the earth with his children. So we are all descendants of Grandpa Noah. He sets the rainbow in the sky. Remember that it had not rained on the earth before the flood, but now that somehow the atmosphere had changed, and now there's going to be rainstorms, and which is what you need to have a rainbow in the sky. We also saw in that chart that lifespans decreased dramatically, and it also explains the ice age, which came as the hydroplate theory also indicates after the flood. And then we spent some time talking about the kinds on the ark. And I love this kind of study, that what is a biblical kind? What is a biblical kind? And I think the key is, the scientists who are doing this say one of the keys is that whether or not it can reproduce or not. So we looked at that Noah didn't need to have one of every kind of bear or big cat or elephant. He just needed 2 from that kind. And then that kind, through adaptation, developed into the multiple different bear species and elephant species and big cat species that we see today. And then we answered the questions, were dinosaurs on the ark? This is one of my favorites too. Were dinosaurs on the ark? And I think the answer is yes, because one of the big reasons why is that we have evidence, as we also spent a bunch of time on, evidence of dinosaurs and men living together at the same time. So God would have created, for example, a kind of sauropod, and then 2 of that kind would have been on the ark. Those began to multiply on the earth again. And as we saw in Job, we actually see a description of a sauropod in the book of Job, which we'll get to in a minute. But we saw lots of evidences for dinosaurs and men living together, including cave drawings and rock drawings. This poor guy looks like he's got a hand knife against a T-Rex. I don't know how that fared, but they memorialized it in a rock, right? And a bunch of clay statues, including this poor young guy that looks like the sauropod got the better of him in this little statue, and this cool thing where the guy is riding the Triceratops. I think that would be so cool. And then, like I mentioned, these 2 descriptions in Job of the behemoth, which sounds an awful lot like a sauropod, right? With a tail like the cedar tree. And I just love the NIV text note description. Probably an elephant. It's like, no, that's why I think God put a little tiny tail on the elephant, so you wouldn't confuse it with the behemoth. And the Leviathan, which we don't know exactly what the Leviathan is, but there is many fossilized remains of these creatures that would potentially fit the description of this Leviathan from the book of Job. So if all life was created in the garden, like we've been discussing some 6,000 years ago, right? And the flood killed off and created the fossil records of all those kind of prehistoric creatures, but 2 of every kind were on that ark, then man and dinosaurs, men and all the animals started to begin to repopulate the earth. And so that means that these dinosaur fossils, which science says are 40 million years old, 50 million years old, 80 million years old, 100 million years old, are actually not that old. And yet literally every single textbook and every single science show that you ever see always says that fossils of dinosaurs are how old? Millions of years old. Well, watch this.
What happened next happened by mistake. Mary put some fragments of the bone in acid to dissolve away the outermost layer of mineral, but the acid worked too fast and all the mineral dissolved away. Being a fossil, there should have been nothing left, but there was, and it was elastic, like living tissue.
This is the piece.
No,
She showed us video she took under the microscope.
that's really what happened?
Yes.
That's the dinosaur
Yeah.
bone?
Without mineral now. That's what was left.
It looked like the soft tissue she would have expected to find if it had been modern bone. This was impossible. This bone was 68 million years old.
So you see this and you think, what? You
I
think
didn't want to tell anybody.
that you'd be ridiculed,
Yes.
right?
And so I said to my technician, okay, do it again. I don't believe it.
And yet, in sample after sample, they were there. Things that looked suspiciously like flexible, transparent blood vessels. She finally mustered the courage to tell Jack.
She said she dissolved the bone away and there were blood vessels, and I was like shocked. I mean,
How could that be?
how could that be? That's right.
The things Mary was finding inside dinosaur bones,
Look at that.
blood vessels, and even what seemed to be intact cells, pose a radical challenge to the existing rules of science, that organic material can't possibly survive even 1 million years, let alone 68 million. Mary, Jack, and their team published their B-Rex findings in a series of papers in the journal Science and were promptly attacked. Critics said their samples might have been contaminated, or that the supposed blood vessels were actually something called biofilm, a type of slime. But as Mary showed us, she's been able to replicate her findings. These are pieces of an even older dinosaur, a well-preserved 80 million year old duckbill. When she dissolved it away in acid,
Let's put this under the scope here.
well, look, is that a blood
This is
vessel?
a blood vessel. You see the branches right there? And look at all of them. And it's so consistent over and over and over again. You do this bone and it comes out and I get excited every time. I can't help it. I mean, 8 million years old.
Mary published her new results last year, and while some of her critics have been swayed, the controversy still rages, and the stakes are high. If blood vessels can survive 80 million years, what about DNA?
Amazing. One of the coolest discoveries in a very long time related to fossils and the entire geological column that science has been telling us for decades and decades is now threatened. But watch in this next clip what question she refuses to ask. All right, this is now MSNBC. This is just like a minute and a half.
And one of the exciting things about this discovery, correct me if I'm wrong, is the fact that this stuff was fossilized as it was, 70 million years old. You don't expect to find soft tissue, do you?
Not at all. No, it was utterly shocking.
So you have to sort of rewrite the book as far as fossilization goes, I assume.
Well, that's the exciting part for me. I've always been very intrigued by how things change in going from a living being to part of the rock record. And like I said, a lot of our science doesn't allow for this. All of the chemistry and all of the molecular breakdown experiments that we've done don't allow for this. So if this material turns out to be actual remnants of the dinosaur, then yes, I think we will have to do some certainly rethinking of some of the basics of the model of fossilization.
You know, Mary, when I was reading about this story, I was amazed that in some of the capillaries, when you went to pull them, they snapped right back. Are you amazed at the quality of these remains?
Absolutely.
70 million years old, huh?
It just doesn't seem possible. But yes, you can actually take the vessels and they do have internal components. And so you can take a probe and kind of squeeze those things out into solution and the vessels are fine. It's just, I can't explain it, to be honest.
Very cool.
Well, Professor Mary Schweitzer, congratulations and thank you very much for stopping by.
Thank you so much.
70 million years old, huh? So that lady, I think she's now on Fox. So she used to be on MSNBC, and I think she has an idea that these may not be actually millions of years old. That's why she asked that question. But remember, she said we have to rethinking the models of fossilization. So in other words, what's her premise? There's soft tissue in a dinosaur fossil. What we understand about fossilization, that can't happen. So we need to rethink everything we know about fossilization. Or We need to rethink what is the age of the fossil. But did you notice that in both clips, and if you watch the whole series, they never go there. It's never asked. There's never any comment. There's never even a hint at the possibility that this thing isn't millions of years old, but thousands of years old, which would fit with our understanding of fossilization, right? You can create a fossil and the the soft tissue could remain in that fossil if those fossils are thousands of years old rather than tens of millions of years old. You see that? But do they even ask the question? Do they even consider the possibility? No. Why? Because evolution is the God of science today. Evolution is the process in which is the explanation of the agnostic and the atheist on how life began. Because if there's any other explanation, that means there has to be a God, a designer, an intelligent creator that gave and created life on this planet. And they can't go there. It's just like the flood, right? There's so much evidence for the flood of Noah, but they can't go there because that means that the Bible would be right. And if they concede any kind of intelligent design argument, that means, oh, we gotta wrestle with the fact that there actually is an intelligent designer. So this kind of graphic is, I just found it on the internet. It fills the textbook. It fills every TV show that you've ever seen. I've watched hundreds and hundreds of TV shows on Animal Planet with my kids over the years, and it's amazing. The whale dives deep down, and its circulatory system is perfectly designed to handle the depths, and blah, 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 blah. Over millions of years, it's evolved the circulatory system. Well, wait a minute. Is it designed, or is it the product of random mutations? They always use this phraseology like it's been designed, or it's perfectly adapted, or something like that. And yet they say that it isn't. And there is the debate. So we need to spend just a little time here tonight to discuss the concepts of whether or not there is an intelligent designer, or whether or not there is actually evidence that evolution is a theory that adequately explains not only two important questions, the diversity and complexity of life that we see today, but two, where did it all come from in the first place? You see what I'm saying? You have to describe, you have to have an understanding or an idea of where it came from in the first place. And then even if life was to be able to be created from non-life, which is what they postulate, you then have the processes of random selection to produce the diversity and complexity of all that life, right? So from the first living cell, all other life, plant and animal life, came from. And do we see that? Does evolution adequately explain it? So here's our high school biology session. So a little history. First, we have to go back to the early 1800s and a guy by the name of William Paley, who wrote about the watchmaker, a book entitled Natural Theology, or Evidences of the Existence and Attributes of the Deity. I loved it back then. All book titles were just, very descriptive of what was actually in the book. In 1802, but in it he wrote that if a pocket watch is found in the woods, it is the most reasonable to assume that someone dropped it and that it was made by a watchmaker. In other words, his argument is that we should be able to recognize whether or not something just happened by chance and just happened to fall in the woods and just be there, or whether or not there's evidence of design. And any person would logically conclude that if you found a pocket watch, that there's no way in billions of years that just happened that metal happened to be smelted and it just fell in place, and springs were, loaded and dials were done and polished and so on and so forth. Everybody knows that somebody made it. And so by extrapolation, you look at the universe and you see the complexity of the universe. Therefore, there must have been a designer. Oop, that was at the bottom. So you see a watch, you inherently know there's a watchmaker. You see the universe, you inherently know there was a universe maker. Very early argument of intelligent design. He argues just as the function and complexity of a watch implies a watchmaker, so likewise the function and complexity of the universe implies a universe maker. Richard Dawkins comes along, I don't know, 100 and some odd years later, and I'm going to read this because this is from his book, and I know you can't really see this up on the screen, but I wanted to read it word for word here. This is from his book, The Blind Watchmaker. Now, Richard Dawkins is kind of one of the more famous atheists and consistently and regularly attacks Christianity, the Bible, and God, and Christians, I would add. So he says this, quote, because he knows that the watchmaker argument is a powerful argument, right? You find a watch in the woods, you know there's a watchmaker. Pretty convincing argument. Well, you gotta argue against that. So here's what he says. Paley's argument is made with passionate sincerity and is informed by the best biological scholarship of the day, but it is wrong, gloriously and utterly wrong. All appearances to the contrary, the only watchmaker in nature is the blind force of physics, natural selection, the blind, unconscious, automatic process which Darwin discovered and which we know is the explanation for the existence and apparent purposeful form of all life, has not purposed in mind. If it can be said to play the role of watchmaker in nature, it is the blind watchmaker. And that's where he got his book title, The Blind Watchmaker. So he says, I know it looks designed, and I know that some might conclude this, but we know that evolution is true, so it can't be, right? He also goes on to say in the book, he said that religion and faith is a delusion, a fixed false belief. I've always contended, by the way, that there's not really any true atheists. There are just people who are really mad at God for some reason. And I don't know why they're mad at God, but they are. God has disappointed them in some way, shape, or form throughout their lives. And I don't think there's truly an atheist that says there's no God. I think deep down, there's something in them that knows there's a God and they're really mad at him. So they call themselves an atheist and attack him and his followers. This argument is a simple one. If a tree falls in the woods, is the old argument, does it make a sound? Well, in this case, if a tree falls in the woods, can enough of them fall down and stack up and make a cabin? It's the same argument. And no reasonable person would ever say that given enough time, billions of years, enough trees could fall, right, in enough storms over enough period of time to eventually have the trees all fall and line up so that one day they make a cabin like that. No one would ever conclude that. But that's precisely what natural selection, what Darwinism says, that given enough time, anything is possible, including enough trees to fall in the shape of a cabin. Right? You see the argument? So along comes Darwin about 50 years after, and he theorizes in his famous book, or infamous book, Origins of Species, that all species descended over time from common ancestors through a process called natural selection. Small successive changes in an organism that led to one species becoming another species, and so on. And then, of course, in 1925, we have the infamous Snopes trial, where this biology teacher in Tennessee, I thought it was Nebraska, was the prosecution of a science teacher, John Scopes, for teaching, oh, it's Scopes, not Snopes. So my title is wrong, for teaching evolution in the Tennessee public school, it was Tennessee, which a recent bill had made illegal. So the legislature had passed a bill that said, no, we're not going to have that taught in our schools. Kind of like maybe CRT today, right? You know, we're going to pass a bill. We're not going to teach this stuff in our school because it's wrong. Well, he taught it anyway, and there was a trial. He was actually found guilty of teaching evolution in the school. And I think he was fined like $1,000 or $100 or $1,000, but then it was overturned later on a technicality. So he never actually was punished. But I think this trial, if you think, how was in your high school classes, if you've ever studied this, how was this trial portrayed? Who was on the right side, according to what you probably read or studied about this? What, it was the evolutionists, right? Because I think this was a defining moment for America, that those that would question this were mocked. So here's one newspaper cartoon where it's speak not, hear not, see not, right? So it's mocking the Christians who are saying, basically describing that there was a special creation of all life as opposed to evolutionary thinking. And I think that was one of these defining moments in our nation's history where the pendulum started to swing and away from special creation and the Genesis account of origins of life to the scientific, the enlightened, the, whatever idea of evolution. Because, us Christians are just backwards, weak-minded people, right? Fast forward about 80 years. Yes, sir. Did it? I never saw the movie. So what was the name of the movie? Inherit the Wind. And did you see the movie?
I did.
And it probably made.
It made the Christian side of it look.
Yeah, it made the Christian explanation of origins look silly. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think it was. I think it was a defining moment for this lie.
Interesting though that actually Darwin ordered Taylor's theory in the context of we didn't know what was in the cell. This idea, irreducible complexity, right? And this idea that people over time we learn that it's common.
Oh, you're gonna love the next several slides. That is a perfect question and lead into one of my core arguments against evolution. And he is describing that Darwin didn't understand much of the complexity that we're going to look at tonight. Okay, and you're going to see the complexity of biological systems that are in every single cell in your body. And so we're going to look at that in detail tonight. So fast forward 80 years, and I had to show this clip.
Moving through history.
I'm sorry, I got to explain. This is from Expel. This is Ben Stein's documentary on this very issue about intelligent design versus evolution.
Moving through history in an unguided and undesigned way, the theory of evolution.
Excuse me,
Yes. Ben.
how did life begin in the first place?
Mr. Stein, you have the same question every time.
You never answered.
You know, we've been through this so many times. We're having
Has there
so.
been an intelligent designer? I made a movie. Big stuff. Controversial documentary film.
If they value their careers, they should keep quiet about their intelligent design views.
I was viewed as an intellectual terrorist.
I've looked at truth like this for my 30 years.
I lost my job.
It's a funny thing, the questions that aren't properly considered don't go away.
How do you get from an inorganic world to the world itself?
It might have started off on the backs of Christians.
So you have no idea how to start.
No, I think
No. So intelligent design is regarded as
God is the largest animal life. Fairies, angels.
science makes no use of the hypothesis of God.
I mean, it's essentially official policy of the National Academy of Science that religion and science will not be related.
there are people out there who want to keep science in a little box where it can't possibly touch a higher power, cannot possibly touch God.
So,
Expel. No intelligence allowed.
It's awesome.
Isn't that hilarious? Hang on, somebody unmuted themselves here, so I'm going to mute them for them. All right, I got them. Just hilarious. I love the guy. Brian and I joke about this all the time, and I even used his accents because the guy that says, well, he asked him, well, where do you think life comes from? And he goes, well, some theorize that they begin on the back of crystals, and then on the back of crystals is where, you know, some amino acids came together and blah, blah, blah. But later he says, but we really don't know where life actually began. And he goes, well, I already told you on the back of crystals, you know, and it's like, and earlier it was a theory, but then he says, no, it's on the back of crystals. So we don't know. We're going to see the law of biogenesis in just a minute, that life only comes from life. This is one of the guys that was expelled. I put his picture up here only because he's from Iowa State University, which is where I went to, and he wrote a book called The Privileged Planet. In this book, he simply said that the Earth is uniquely positioned to support life in a whole bunch of different categories. And if just one of those categories is off one way or another by a few percentage points, that life would not be able to survive on this planet. And that's what the book said. And he got expelled. He lost his tenure, you know, whatever, or he didn't get tenure or something, so on. So fast forward a few years later, and we are at the Chicago Field Museum. And it just happens to be Darwin's 150th anniversary. So the Field Museum is all decked out for this anniversary because remember, this is their God. So you have to celebrate their God. So this is the picture that was on the front entranceway in 2009 as we walked into the Field Museum. Now remember, this is one of these kind of icons of evolution, right? This picture of chimpanzees growing up into be man. What you may not know is this is actually the full picture. What are you pointing at? Which one?
The first guy.
The first guy. So this is the full picture that was in the original 1965 layout of the March of Mankind over these years. So this has become an iconic picture. Every single kid in the country has seen this picture, right? Well, here we go to the Field Museum in Chicago. And how many of you have been to the Field Museum? About half of you. What's on the first floor? Huh? Well, and stuffed animals, right? Stuffed animals from all over the world. Literally every single animal. I don't know about every single animal. I think I have it. There are more than 19 million zoological specimens found at the Field Museum. Many of them are actually stuffed animals in displays, right? If you've ever been there, that's much of the first floor. So it's actually a museum of real animals. And then you go over to one display in 2009, and I don't know if it's still there or not, but you had this skeletal picture. Well, what is this depicting? The march of life of man, right? From chimpanzee to man. And so those are actual animals, so I'll buy it, but they just put them in a sequence, basically hinting strongly that that's evolutionary forces. But then they had this, the human story begins. You belong to the animal group called hominids. This group includes not only modern humans, but also many other hominid species that once lived the earth. The first appeared some 8 million years ago. It then just goes on to describe this creature here, who is affectionately known as, anybody know? Lucy. This is Lucy. Some of the most famous fossils ever discovered, and as an explanation for the missing link. And we'll look at her in more detail in just a second. But all of this is presented as fact. Every single other stuffed animal they have in there is an actual creature. This is an artist model rendition of a few fragments of fossils that were found called Lucy. And we'll look at those in a minute. This is a similar one in the American Museum of Natural History. Only these two creatures here are not historical. Once again, they are artist renderings of what they believe it looked like. Now, so it's no surprise that after the Scopes trial, after science has basically accepted evolutionary theory, and if you don't accept it, you're expelled. So most people don't say anything, even if they don't believe in evolutionary theory. If you're a high school biology teacher, or especially if you're a college professor, you would never challenge that narrative, right? Because you're going to risk being expelled. And so today we have moved, I know this is small too, I was going to read all this, but I'm not. We have moved from public acceptance of evolution that in 1985 was 40%, in 2007 it's moved up to 54%. I don't have a current statistic over the last 14 years or so, but it's got to be even higher than that. But even in the religious community, it's gone from 8%. So 8% of Christians believed in evolution in 1988 to 32% of Christians in 2009. So that's a third of the church believes in evolutionary theory. I would argue because that's about all they ever hear. Nobody ever challenges it. It's accepted, right? So there's the report, Public Acceptance of Evolution in the United States, 1985 to 2020. So that's the report. So it's no longer Imago Dei in the image of God, but Imago Goo. I can't claim that. That was Del Tackett from the Truth Project. I love that line. But I tell you, there is a crack in this evolutionary wall that they have built up, right? This whole cancel culture, you think cancel culture is new? No, it's been going on for decades with lie after lie after lie. And one of the biggest ones is evolution. But that evolutionary wall is beginning to crack. In fact, this is a document on a website that says 1,000 PhD scientists worldwide have signed onto this list, openly dissenting from evolutionary theory. This is a guy by the name of Dr. David Berlinski. He's not a Christian, but he is going to summarize kind of the argument against the idea that evolution explains anything.
Well, the stuff about fish beaks is certainly interesting. Let's confuse ourselves about that. The question is, can it be extrapolated? What does it represent cyclic variation? I can say, here's an account of how the eagle flies. Look, get up, I jump in the air, I flap my hands a couple of times, and I land a few feet from where I start. Thus, the origin of flight. The obvious response is, this is nutty. Flap your hands as long as you want. You won't fly like an eagle. The argument from extrapolation can work in some circumstances. It fails in other circumstances. Plainly, in the case of a human being who jumps 2 feet in the air and then lands 2 feet from where he started, the argument from extrapolation fails. What persuades you in the case of the Galapagos finch that what seem to be cyclic variations of the start, the commencement of the process of speciation? That's a step in the argument that has to be completed. It's not enough to say, well, it's more of the same. It's not more of the same self-evidently. It can easily be bounded variation of exactly the same sort as we see in any species experiment. No, the contrary may be true. We may be seeing the development of entirely new species. The Galapagos finch starts off as a finch, and within 100 million years will be a Galapagos elephant. Could be, but we need a whole lot more. By the way, evidence that a couple of nutty journalists going down and looking at finch beaks and writing a Pulitzer Prize book. A whole lot more serious science. And this doesn't even pass the threshold of anecdote. Finch beaks change in size. Yeah, they change in shape too. It seems to be correlated with seasons. It seems to be regressed back to the mean when the season changes. If this is the part of a spectacular evolutionary extrapolation, let's have additional reasons for thinking that. Otherwise, we're not even talking about a scientific hypothesis.
So evolution is not even a scientific hypothesis. I mean, that's how critical he is of this. The finch beaks get bigger, they get smaller, they adapt. If one kind of bear was on the ark Did that bear adapt and change into multiple what we would call species today? Yes. Finch beaks change. Could you end up at some point in time with multiple species of finches? Yes. But I would contend you come back in 100 million years, like he said, and the finch is never going to change into an elephant, ever. It's always going to be a finch. So Darwin himself gave two criteria. The first one is what we were talking about earlier, that if you do not answer these questions or see these things, in the case of number 2, then his theory is going to absolutely break down. So the first one has to do with complexity. And he said this. So Darwin in his book said, quote, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed, which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory of evolution would absolutely break down, but I can find no such case. Now, there was also the comment that when 150 years ago or more now, when Darwin understood the cell, he understood that there was a membrane and some plasma and a nucleus, and that's about it. He did not understand anything else about it. Now, as we're going to see tonight in this complexity argument, there's a lot more that's going on in the cell than just a blob, right, surrounded by a membrane. But where I want to go to start this argument is something else you mentioned. That's the concept of irreducible complexity. This concept, it sounds hard to understand. It's just very simple. In order for something to work, you need all the pieces there. Does that make sense? If you take the button away from this, it no longer functions. If you remove the battery, it no longer functions. If you remove the light, the laser light, it no longer functions, right? So in order to perform a function, a system needs all of its parts there. If you take a tire away from a car, it no longer works. If you take a spark plug away, see, that's the concept of irreducible complexity. Well, this is a story about a guy who studied Bacterial Flagellum for 20, 30 years or something. And he discovered this concept of irreducible complexity.
And so from that point on, I became very
By the way, this is a longer video, so I'm actually going to sit down. I think it's about 12 minutes.
So from that point on, I became very interested in the question of evolution, and since have decided the Darwinian processes are not the whole explanation for life.
Michael Behe's skepticism derived in large measure from what modern biology has revealed about life's most fundamental unit, the cell.
In the 19th century, when Darwin was alive, scientists thought that the basis of life, the cell, was some simple blob of protoplasm, like a little piece of jello or something that was not hard to explain at all.
This perception didn't really change too much until the early 1950s. But in the last half century, our knowledge of the cell has just exploded.
Today, powerful technologies reveal elaborate microscopic worlds so small that a thimbleful of cultured liquid can contain more than 4 billion single-celled bacteria, each packed with circuits, assembly instructions, and miniature machines, the complexity of which Charles Darwin could never have imagined.
At the very basis of life, where molecules and cells run the show, we've discovered machines, literally molecular machines. There are little molecular trucks that carry supplies from one end of the cell to the other. There are machines which capture the energy from sunlight and turn it into usable energy.
There are as many molecular machines in the human body as there are functions that the body has to do. So you think about hearing, seeing, smelling, tasting, feeling, blood clotting, respiratory action, the immune response, all of those require a host of machines.
When we look at these machines, we ask ourselves, where do they come from? And the standard answer, Darwinian evolution, is very inadequate in my view.
And speaking on the topic of scientific naturalism,
During the early 1990s, at a series of academic conferences, Behe first shared his doubts about the ability of natural selection to construct complex molecular machines. One machine particularly attracted his attention.
I remember the first time I looked at a biochemistry textbook and I saw a drawing of something called the Bacterial Flagellum with all of its parts and all of its glory. It's had a propeller and the hook region and the drive shaft and the motor and so on. I looked at that. I said, that's an outboard motor. That's designed. That's no chance assemblage of parts.
Bee's reaction was not surprising, for the molecular motors that drive bacteria through liquid each depend upon a system of intricately arranged mechanical parts. These parts come into focus when portions of a cell are magnified 50,000 times. Biochemists have used electron micrographs like this one to identify the parts and three-dimensional structure of the flagellar motor. In the process, they have revealed a marvel of engineering on a miniaturized scale.
Howard Berg at Harvard has labeled it the most efficient machine in the universe. These machines, some of them are running at 100,000 RPMs and are hardwired into a signal transduction or sensory mechanism so that it's getting feedback from the environment.
And even though they're spinning that fast, they can stop on a dime. It only takes a quarter turn for them to stop and shift directions and start spinning 100,000 RPM in the other direction.
And just like outboard motors on motorboats, it has a large number of parts which are necessary for the motor to work.
The Bacterial Flagellum, 2 gears, 4 reverse, water-cooled, proton motive force. It has a stator, it has a rotor, it has a U-joint, it has a drive shaft, it has a propeller, and they function as these parts of the machines. It's, it's not convenient that we give them these names. That's truly their function.
Since its discovery, scientists have tried to understand how a rotary motor could have arisen through natural selection. As yet, they have failed to offer any detailed Darwinian explanation. To see why, we must understand a feature of molecular machines known as irreducible complexity.
Irreducible complexity was coined by Mike Behe in describing these molecular machines. Basically, what it says is that you have multi-component parts to any given organelle or system in a cell, all of which are necessary for function. That is, if you remove one part, you lose function of that system.
The idea of irreducible complexity can be illustrated by a familiar non-biological machine, a mousetrap. The trap is composed of 5 basic pieces: a catch to hold the bait, a strong spring, a thin bent rod called the hammer, a holding bar to secure the hammer in place, and a platform upon which the entire system is mounted. If any one of these parts is missing or defective, the mechanism will not work. All components of this irreducibly complex system must be present simultaneously for the machine to perform its function, catching mice. Irreducible complexity also applies to biological machines, including the Bacterial Flagellum motor.
All told, there are about 40 different protein parts which are necessary for this machine to work. And if any of those parts are missing, then either you get a flagellum that doesn't work because it's missing the hook or it's missing the drive shaft or whatever, or it doesn't even get built within the cell.
In evolutionary terms, you have to be able to explain how you can build this system gradually when there's no function until you have all those parts in place.
The irreducible complexity of molecular machines poses a severe challenge to the power of natural selection. According to Darwin's theory, even very complex biological structures like an eye, an ear, or a heart can be built gradually over time in small incremental steps. Yet, as Darwin made clear, natural selection can only succeed if these random genetic changes provide some advantage to the evolving organism in its struggle for survival.
As I have attempted to show, it is not necessary to suppose that the modifications are all simultaneous if they were extremely slight and gradual. Natural selection is scrutinizing the slightest variations, rejecting those that are bad, preserving and adding up all that are good.
But could Darwin's small, favorable variations have produced a bacterial flagellum? Some scientists doubt the possibility.
How could something new, like a bacterial flagellar motor and all the components that go with it, how could it develop out of a population of bacteria that don't have that system? When each change, according to Darwin's theory, has to provide some kind of advantage.
Imagine such a scenario early in the Earth's history. An evolving bacterium somehow develops a tail and perhaps even the pieces necessary to attach it to the cell wall. Yet without a complete motor assembly, this innovation would provide no advantage to the cell. Instead, the tail would lie immobile and useless, invisible to natural selection, which by definition can only favor changes that aid survival.
The logic of natural selection is very demanding. Unless the flagellum mechanism is completely assembled and actually works, natural selection simply cannot preserve it. It cannot be passed on to the next generation.
The important thing to realize about natural selection is it selects only for a functional advantage. In most cases, natural selection actually eliminates things that have no function or that have a function that harms the organism. So if you had a bacterium with a tail that didn't function as a flagellum, chances are natural selection would eliminate it. The only way you can select for a flagellum is if you have a flagellum that works, and that means you have to have all the pieces of the motor in place to begin with. So natural selection can't get you the bacterial flagellum. It can only work after the flagellum is there and operating.
In 1996, Michael Behe published a book titled Darwin's Black Box. In it, he argued that natural selection, Darwin's designer substitute, could not explain the origin of the bacterial flagellum or any other irreducibly complex biological system. Instead, Behe concluded that the integrated complexity of these systems pointed to intelligent design. Darwin's black box created immediate controversy. Over 75 publications, including some of the world's leading newspapers and scientific journals, reviewed the book. Some scientists praised Behe's work, while others dismissed it as unscientific and religiously motivated. Behe's critics also insisted that he had underestimated the power of natural selection. They argued that the flagellar motor could have been constructed from parts used to build simpler molecular machines, like this needle-nose cellular pump. If the components of the pump already existed, they could have been preserved by natural selection, even before the bacterial motor arose. This theory is called co-option.
It's essentially saying that evolution or natural selection at some point was able to borrow components of one molecular machine and build a new machine with some of these components.
Scott Minnick has studied the flagellar motor for nearly 20 years. His research has led him to challenge the co-option argument.
With the bacterial flagellum, you're talking about a machine that's got 40 structural parts. Yes, we find 10 of them are involved in another molecular machine, but the other 30 are unique. So where are you going to borrow them from? Eventually, you're going to have to account for the function of every single part as originally having some other purpose. So you can only follow that argument so far until you run into the problem of you're borrowing parts from nothing. But even if you can see that you have all the parts necessary to build one of these machines, that's only part of the problem. Maybe even more complex, I think more complex, is the assembly instructions. That is never addressed by opponents of the irreducible complexity argument.
So he goes on to describe that the assembly instruct, even if you were able to evolve all the individual parts that were needed to create this system, this irreducibly complex system, which by the way, there's thousands of them, right? You know, every single part function of your body is an irreducibly complex system. Actually, it's made up of multiple irreducibly complex components within these larger systems. And he goes on to say, even if you have all these components, they have to be assembled in the right way, right? Which he just said is in a lot of cases even more complicated. It's like saying, okay, I evolved all the pieces to the house, so you got a house. It's like, no. You got to put them all together. And you can't start with the windows, right? You got to start with the foundation and then the framing and then the so on and so forth. So the building and structures are even more complex than coming up with the individual components themselves. The bottom line is that evolution ideas don't even come close to answering these questions, right? And I just love the example of the mousetrap. So irreducible complexity is the simple concept, really, that in order for the mousetrap to work, all these components have to be there. And in biological systems, those components are protein structures that you need to be able to build and assemble together. So think about this for a second. You want to propel a boat through the water. How are you going to do that? Well, if you lived a couple thousand years ago, you get a bunch of slaves and you put them on oars and you row the boat through the water, right? And then you figure out wind power and you make some sails and you put all the rigging in place, designed. And then eventually you go, oh, we got a steam engine. Let's build a paddle wheel and that will push us through the water. And then someone comes up with a great idea. Let's put a propeller on a crankshaft and spin it at high speeds and we'll propel it through the water. But you got to design the entire thing. That's what you just saw. A designed system. Cool. All right, comments on irreducible complexity. Does that make sense? It really does, doesn't it? And evolution doesn't come close to answering it. Why does my keep going out? All right, I'm going to skip this one. It's just the inner workings of the cell. It's only 3 minutes long, but it is so cool. But I'm running out of time and I want to get through this whole presentation because we need to get to the end stuff next week. But it's basically many factories. It describes many factories within every cell in your body and just the complexity of each and every working cell. By the way, these are all from a video called Unlocking the Mysteries of Life, which you can actually watch online, and I highly recommend it. So Darwin said if evolution can't explain the complexity that people eventually find in biological systems, his theory would absolutely break down. And he said, I can find no such case, but now we have. Like he said, in the last 50 years, the understanding of the inner workings of cell and biological systems has exploded. Complexity comments. Do you understand the argument? There's too much complexity in biological systems to be explained by small successive changes over time. Oh, I hate that. For some reason, my computer started beeping every time I go forward or backward on a PowerPoint presentation. The next area is another quote from Darwin himself, who said this about transitionary fossils. The number of intermediate varieties which have formerly existed on Earth must be truly enormous. The strata must be full of them, basically. But if you, organic chain, and this perhaps is the most obvious and gravest objections which can be urged against my theory, if you don't find a bunch of transitionary fossils. In other words, we didn't have a lot of fossils when he wrote this book, very few. Most of them have been found in the last 150 years. And he was saying, you should find all these transitionary species in the fossil record. And if you don't, his theory is going to break down once again. Here is Dr. Berlinski again.
The claim that there are no transitional sequences.
This is about 2 minutes.
Or nothing that looks like a transitional sequence. Certainly is false. There are plenty of things that look like transitional sequences. And one of the interesting discoveries in the last 10, 15 years, the discovery of Ambulocetus natans.
We'll look at that animal.
Which seems to be midway between the terrestrial mammal, from which the whales are said to derive, and some actual sea-going organism. It was found on land. It seems to be something stubby with things that look like they might develop fins in due time. There's no question, this strengthens the idea of an evolutionary sequence. It's pointless to deny it. However, the question has to be raised, as it should be raised whenever an evolutionary sequence is mentioned. What are exactly the predicted properties one would expect to find as one passes from a land-dwelling creature to a sea-dwelling creature? Specifically, how many changes are required to go from a creature such as Amniocentesis, which seems to have been a land-dwelling creature, to a creature that spends the entire portion of its life in the ocean? Curiously enough, this is not a question that evolutionary biologists ask a whole lot. I did some seed at the end, back of the envelope calculations myself, and the most modest estimate I could come up with is that an organism requires roughly 50,000 morphological changes to adapt itself to the open-going ocean. For example, a whale has about 2 tons of oil stuck up in its head, so it can die. It has a breathing spout on the top of its head, Amniocentesis doesn't. It has pectoral muscles that are specifically designed for navigation in the ocean. It has an enormously complicated feeding system. Whales are mammals, after all. Enormously complicated feeding system, so it can pass milk to its young in the open ocean. Nothing else living in the ocean has anything like this. But the question is not whether this is an evolutionary sequence. Sure it is. It's very, very persuasive, very interesting. The question is, what other part of the story isn't being told? And as soon as we introduce a quantitative estimate, however loose, however flat, however spontaneous, then a great deal of puzzlement starts to intrude into the otherwise sunny picture. 50,000 changes, and we've got 2 members of the sequence. Where are the other 49,999 members of that sequence if Darwinian changes are incremental and they're small? After all, we're not talking about changes that are arbitrary. A creature must have these changes to survive in the open ocean. We've got an evolutionary sequence that has 6 members. We need at least 50,000 more. They're not there. What does this suggest about the Darwinian scenario? Now, I don't know the answer to this question. I don't want to give you the wrong impression. I'm very impressed that just where a paleontologist said it would be, there was a creature that seems somehow intermediary between the completely land-dwelling and the completely ocean-dwelling creature. That's an important bit of evidence. It's an important bit of evidence in favor of a Darwinian hypothesis. But it leads to the next step in the richness, the originating and development of the scientific theory. It leads to the first attempt to put a quantitative number on this. And any attempt to put a quantitative number should induce a profound sense of perplexity because the number of changes is so much greater than anything we see in the transitional record. Now, what is the proper explanation of this? Please understand, I don't have it, but neither do the other guys. Neither do the other guys. And in my opinion, they refuse to recognize the legitimacy of the question. That is a fundamental question of paleontology. How many changes are required? Can those changes be compared to the fossil record?
You see what he's saying? To go from land dwelling to sea going, there's about 50,000 changes. Well, you should find all of these fossils of all of these transitionary creatures. And he says we have 6 out of 50,000, right? Which I haven't questioned the 6 because I think these creatures, which they call as transitionary, are just other species that have gone extinct. They're fully adapted, fully, perfectly suited for their environment creatures, fully formed and functioning, and are not truly, transitionary fossils at all. So this is one of the creatures that he was talking about. This creature that kind of looks like a mud skipper, right? A giant mud skipper, which we're going to have a picture of, whatever. But it's like a crocodile of some sort or another that's more lizard-like, that spent a lot more time in the water with fins instead of with feet, and could get up on land and crawl kind of like a mud skipper, whatever. But it was probably perfectly adapted for its environment. So does it appear as, like Dr. Brzezinski said, as potentially one of the transitionary fossils in a sequence? Well, sure, I guess it would if that's your theory. This would be one of the, but you need, like he said, 4,999 more in order to get from one creature to the other. How many of you have heard of the dinosaur bird? This is probably one of the most famous transitionary fossils that is out there today. and it has completely changed. When you were growing up, what happened to the dinosaurs? Destroyed by an asteroid, right? That's what they're all destroyed by. Now what has happened to the dinosaurs? I don't know how they all died, but they all evolved into birds. So the Brachiosaurus that was, 80 feet long evolved into a sparrow, right? A T-Rex evolved into a chickadee, whatever. I don't know. But that's the theory, right? So here is this fossil. It kind of looks a little dinosaurish in the head, and it appears to have feathers on it. So we have this species. Was it a winged dinosaur, or was this just a bird? Have you ever seen an ostrich or some of these things? They're very kind of dinosaurish and whatever. Or was it just a fully formed bird that is now extinct? Paleontologists have tried to turn, I can't never say this name. Can you say it? Say it again. Archaeopteryx. Okay. Into an earthbound feathered dinosaur, but it's not. It's a bird, a perching bird, and no amount of paleobabble is going to change that, as one creationist said. So is that a missing link, or is it just an extinct species? Fully formed, developed, created by God, bird? I think the latter. Once again, the mud skipper is often quoted as a transitionary species. And yet I read this one in a science textbook, said the mud skippers are among the best adapted fishes to an amphibious lifestyle. And it's like, once again, we have this language. It's perfectly adapted for its environment to be able to get up on the mud and to go and eat and collect its food and then go back into the water. It's perfectly adapted. And as far as history is concerned, a mud skipper has never been born that has legs and got up and crawled away, because it still has what? Still has gills. It's still a fish. Would it be very good at surviving out of the water 100% of the time? No, it wouldn't. You got to change about 50,000 things in order for it to be good at living outside the water full time. Species after species, even those that are alive and extinct, seem to be adapted to the environment in which they live. And now we come to man and the transitionary fossils of men. So we have several of these missing links, as they're called, that we're going to talk about. The first one is Piltdown Man, discovered in 1913. It ended up, and then here's a drawing of a kind of caveman-like missing link. And remember, who drew this? This is an artist's depiction of the missing link, right? So they can draw it however they want. And we'll see that in a minute. But it was simply a jawbone. That's all they had, was a jawbone. And it was proven to be a complete hoax. Even though this news went around the world as the missing link, it was a complete hoax. It was found that the jawbone was really an orangutan, and it was deliberately combined with the cranium of a human to make it look more ape-like. Complete fabrication. And that was in 1913. Nebraska Man. In 1922, solely on the basis of a worn fossil tooth from Nebraska, this guy described this new species of man as the first arthropod ape from North America, based on a tooth that ended up being a peccary tooth. Now, purposefully or not, I don't know that it's ever been proven one way or another, but this illustration that you see here in this slide went around the world again. And based on a tooth, they made this diagram of the missing link, early man. And you see they're very human looking. We have a pair of them. We have the woman cooking and the man hunting. We got the gender roles already assigned. Back there is caveman and so on. And this was in London newspapers around the world. And so the world started seeing this lie that, oh, there's these missing links out there. But once again, a peccary, it's like a pig. All right. It was just a tooth. That's all they had. And yet this diagram, this drawing went around. Peking Man, 1921. They discovered two molar teeth in a depression near the village of whatever, outside of Peking and Beijing. And these two teeth were given the name, a new species of missing link man. and it's affectionately known as Peking man. And there was actually a set of fossils that were found, but and many plaster molds were made of them to basically so that we could have them for a long time and send them around the world. But all the fossils were mysteriously lost in 1938 or something, and so they're gone. And so there are some who have speculated that these were also hoaxed, that they were set up, that these weren't actually what they claimed that they were. It was just a big lie, because science needs to have this humanoid missing link in order to prove the evolutionary dogma that man came from apes. That's Peking man. Here's some of the fossils that were actually recovered, but now they're all gone. They're all lost. Just fragments once again. So what was going on at this time in the early 20s that would prompt some to try to prove evolution? Well, a guy by the name of William Jennings Bryan was going around the country saying things. He became a leader in the so-called fundamentalist crusade against evolution in the early 20s. In 1921, trying out arguments that would receive wider attention during the Scopes monkey trials in 1925. Bryan preached that the great quote, the greatest enemy of the Bible is the numerous enemy, and the numerous enemy today is the believer in the Darwinian hypothesis that man is a lineal descendant of the lower animals. That's what was going on at the time. So you had the Scope trials that came along just a few years after this, of which he was the lead attorney, right, for the prosecution. He also ran for president a few times. I think at the bottom of his presidential thing, he says, equal rights to all. Oh, what a concept, right? And it says special privileges to no one. What a concept, right? Kind of what America was founded on, maybe. At the top, it says justice and humanity and liberty at the top of his thing. So we have the famous Scope trials, the monkey trials. I'm not going to read this. This is history. Actually, I am. I got to read part of it. This is a picture actually of the defense attorney standing who called Bryan as a witness. He called the prosecuting attorney as a witness. Why? He wanted to mock Christianity and the Bible in front of the court. That's the only reason why. And the judge finally cut it off after 2 hours. But Darrow, the defense attorney, suggested that the stories of the Bible could not be scientific and should not be used in teaching science, with Darrow telling Bryan, you insult every man of science and learning in the world because he does not believe in your fool religion. He goes on to basically says, at the top paragraph, including questions about whether Eve was actually made from the rib of a man. You can't really believe that kind of nonsense, can you? And later, Bryan declared this, quote, the reason I am answering up on that he agreed to be questioned is not for the benefit of the superior court. It is to keep these gentlemen from saying that I was afraid to meet them and let them question me. And I want the Christian world to know that any atheist, agnostic, unbeliever can question me anytime as to my belief in God, and I will answer. I think on this subject, generally, the church is woefully underprepared to give an account, to answer, to say, no, evolution is wrong. It does not explain where life came from, nor its complexity and diversity. And yet we don't have the information, we don't have the knowledge. We are afraid of being expelled or canceled, right? So I don't think we do it. I don't think we defend it. We don't defend the Genesis account of creation that we've been studying the last 8 weeks. Neanderthal Man. Oh, this is my favorite. Because they have found some skulls in the fossil record where they've made, and this is an artist model. Once again, they've taken a skull and made an artist model of Neanderthal Man. This is a distinct, separate creature. Now, this one isn't a chimp or an ape or a peccary tooth or whatever. We actually have skulls. But the question is this a man or is this some intermediate species going from ape to man? That's the basic question. Well, it's mostly on the size and shape and characteristics of the skull that they're basing it on. So they look at this guy's skull and they say, oh, it's a little elongated. He's got a heavy brow line that protrudes a little bit. And so this must be a different species than man, except they've never met this guy. Because I think this guy was actually the model for the artist when he was making Neanderthal Man. I mean, they're almost identical. And he's not a missing link. I'm guessing that he's a man, right? 100% a man. And yet somehow these other fossils that have a heavier brow and elongated skull are the missing link of Neanderthal Man, of which they have several. So here he is again from a side profile. And once again, I find a guy that almost looks identical to Neanderthal Man. This is actually a Russian boxer, I think this is. But look at that brow. I think his brow line is actually bigger than Neanderthal's brow line. You see that? That's what skull shape is. So look, here is what science believes, and there's actually more. There's probably 20 of these, but these are the main ones going from Lucy, which we're going to look at in a minute, to Homo sapiens, us. And that is the common belief over and over and over and over and over and over again. And I would argue that each one of those fossil records is just some unique individual species, not a transition from one to another. And it's all based on basically differences in size and shapes of skulls. I mean, if you found these two skulls, fossilized skull, that big guy and that little guy, would you conclude it's two different species? You probably would, right? Here's a people group in Africa that actually has very pronounced elongated skulls. And then of course we got, you know, the cone heads in there. That's not real. In the early 1800s, science evaluating skull shapes concluded that the white man, the Asian man, and the black man were actually three different races, species. And so you had the Caucasoid, the Mongoloid, and the Negroid. And what was happening in the late 1700s and the early 1800s? Well, we had this movement of freedom and liberty, and all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, and so on and so forth. And yet slavery was taking hold in America and in Europe. So how do you reconcile those two things? Well, you make the black man a different species, a different evolutionary outcome based on skull shapes. Now, today, as we've talked about, the different races are really ethnicities in this world, and we're all descendants of Noah. So did we all come from the same grandfather? Yes, we did. There's only one race. Oh, I'm running out of time.
I hear this one a lot. How can there be so many races in the world? They're all descendants of Adam and Eve. Well, check this out. First off, let's talk about the word race. Sometimes when people use the word, they mean supposed races of people who have evolved at different times, rates, and in different locations. That's not true. Of course, the word race is also a term used to distinguish between groups with different physical traits, namely skin color. But are there really different races? Take a gander at Acts 17:26, where it is written that God, from one man, made every nation of men. It's clear then that the Bible teaches that there is one race, the human race. The Bible is also clear that all people on the earth are descendants of Adam and Eve, who were created by God. Check Genesis 1:26-28, easy enough. God created two people in his image, male and female, and told them to increase in number. So Adam and Eve are mom and dad of the human race. Then their children had children, and those children had children, and so on and so forth for many generations until, according to Genesis 6:9,
that should be a couple billion, right?
8 people who were protected inside an ark during the global flood. And those 8 people later walked off the ark, and according to Genesis 9:19, from them came the people who were scattered over the earth. Well, wait a second. What do I mean scattered? Well, jump over to Genesis 11. Let's talk about an event known as the Tower of Babel. Basically, because of the sinful actions of the descendants of Noah, the Lord confused their language and scattered them from there over all the earth. That's pretty clear and concise. Okay, so we've got lots of people who were descendants of the 8 folks who came off the ark, and now they have been scattered all over the earth. That explains that we were still one race and that different groups of people ended up in different locations. But how do we get a bunch of different colored people if we were all one race? Well, follow along. This, of course, is a simplified explanation, but the basic principles are true. We all have a pigment in our bodies called melanin, which, depending on different variables, produces different shades of the one main skin color we all possess. Several genes control the amount of melanin produced and thus the variability in the skin shade. In fact, it's easy for one couple to produce a wide range of skin shade variability in just one generation, as we'll see in just a moment. Time for a quick genetics lesson. DNA is the molecule of heredity that is passed from parents to children. A child inherits 23 chromosomes from each parent. Each chromosome pair contains hundreds of genes, which regulate the physical development of the child. However, to illustrate basic genetic principles pertaining to the topic, we'll just talk about 2 genes, the genes that control the production of melanin. So let capital A and capital B symbolize versions of the gene that code for large amounts of melanin, while little a and little b code for small amounts. Got it? Easy. Check this out. Take a look at the upper left. Let's say dad contributes capital A, capital B genes, and mom contributes capital A, capital B genes as well. Together, they will produce a child with capital A, capital A, capital B, and capital B. This is a kid with a lot of melanin, and thus he will have very dark skin. Easy to see. Here's the bigger point, though. Let's say dad contributes capital A, capital B, and mom contributes little a and little b. Well, the child's skin will be middle brown shade, the combination of capital A, little a, and capital B, little b, which, by the way, represents the majority of the world's population. Not only that, but if each parent is capital A, little a, capital B, little b, the combinations that could be produced in their children could result in a very wide range of skin shades in just one generation. So, since Adam and Eve were the first people ever, it makes sense to conclude that God placed in them a combination of genes that can produce all different shades of skin we see. Those same combinations would be present in Noah and the 7 other people who were in the ark. And because God dispersed people at the Tower of Babel, he dispersed the population, thereby isolating gene pools of the different people groups. Over time, different cultures formed in different locations with certain features like skin shade becoming predominant. And here we are today. And since we all go back to Noah and his family, it makes sense that they're all different shades of brown. One race, multiple people groups, just like the Bible teaches.
Cool. That was from Answers in Genesis, by the way. Very good video. And here's this picture that I showed last week. I just think that's so cool that these 2 are twins. Those 2 are twins. Same mom, same dad, different skin color. And different physical characteristics. One's taller, this one's taller than the other one. And she has a little curlier hair and dark, and hers is strawberry and lighter and straighter. And I mean, all the physical characteristics come from our genes from our parents. So you have a couple of, your daughter is darker skin, dark olive skin. And so it's very easy. Okay, Lucy. 8 minutes for Lucy? Oh, Lucy. One of the most famous fossils ever discovered is, oh, I can't say that word. Can you say that word? Lucy, we call her Lucy. Those are the actual fossils that were found, all right? And actually, this fossil right there was shown to be a baboon fossil, and there are some who claim that they actually manipulated that fossil, the hip bone fossil, to make it appear more upright as opposed to a chimpanzee and an ape-like function, and so that charge is out there well. But anyway, here's the argument. Once you look at these fossils, you got to decide what they best fit. Do they best fit in a chimpanzee, the picture on the left? Or if you kind of stretch them out and say, I've got actually these fragments, is it a walking missing link ape-like creature? That's the debate. Now, I've read way too much on Lucy, and I can tell you which one I think it is clearly, right? I think it's clearly the one on the left. But I want to show you what the world does with those fossils. They take those fossils, of which, by the way, do we actually have the skull? No, we got part of the jawbone and part of the cranium. That's it. Right? So we're going to take those fossils. I hate that beep. And these are different artist renderings of what they thought that Lucy looked like. Well, that's one looks like a bald man, and so sorry, yeah, the bald people in the back row. One looks like an orangutan, one looks like an ape, one looks like a missing link, right? But that's not it. These are 3-dimensional models I'm going to show you. This is one that's in the Natural History Museum in Washington, D.C. Once again, natural history. That's a complete fabrication of what this thing looked like. There's no species like that. They are making this more a little more man-like by having it stand up, but not quite all the way. So that one's probably actually more accurate. This is another example of a Lucy reconstruction, and I don't remember where that one is, someplace in the United States, but others have taken these same bones and said, no, it's more of an upright creature. So we're going to draw it more upright, including our Lucy from the Field Museum, which only has on the first floor stuffed real animals, except for Lucy and the artist rendering of Lucy, which isn't a real character at all. So here's the pieces of the skull that they actually found. And here on the other side, so there's Lucy, just the brown parts we have. And here is a skull of a bonobo, which is basically a relative of the chimpanzee, of the common chimpanzee, same phyla, same group or family or whatever, genus, same genus. And there is a bonobo. It looks kind of like a chimpanzee, right? Well, this is the artist, so that if you're going to guess what that fossil actually was, that should be your first choice, the bonobo. But here is how other artists have depicted it. Here's a mom carrying the baby. I'm surprised they don't have a sling or a wrap or something, or maybe one of those new Prego strollers or whatever that they're pushing it. And once again, dad has the you know, the weapons to battle and to kill things with. The middle one is in Houston. So somebody made another model, and then somebody actually made a whole family of Lucys, and this time they didn't put any fur on them, right? So they're really human looking, no fur at all. And this is Lucy. This is in the Human Origins Hall of the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. There is the male and the female, and walking, you know, like they're going to a movie or something, right? You know, hey, babe, you know, how's it going? Right? Natural history? This is natural history? It's a complete artist imaginary rendering of the fossils that you saw earlier, which most likely are the bonobos, the chimp fossils. Here, by the way, is an actual lit picture. If you notice that one, they darkened or something, and you can actually see that they made them anatomically correct, very human looking anatomically and so on. So if I was to show you, this is actually another close relative. It's a little more dramatic once we put the skin on it, so I use this one instead. This is a Bornean orangutan and a human skull. Now from those skulls, you'd say, well, those two things probably look very similar, wouldn't you? They've got very similar skulls, but we know these two species look like that. They don't look anything alike. So all they're doing is taking the skull and taking human characteristics and animal characteristics and blending them together. So when I taught this class the first time, National Geographic had a huge spread on some new fossils that were found, because you know, every 15 years or so, you need to find another missing link fossil, and another artist gets to make a depiction of what they think it looks like. This guy kind of looks like I don't know, what is it, cross between, he looks like somebody, a famous person that I can't remember. But if you think he looks like someone, let me know, because doesn't he look like somebody? Like in a TV show or something? I can't put my finger on it, but very human looking, right? Almost Asian looking, if you will, in a way. So scientists have discovered a new species of human, they say. Well, one of the things it tells you down below is they actually use bear fur. So let's create it with some human characteristics and some animal characteristics, and voila, we have the missing link, right? Will we ever find a missing link? The answer is no way. While skulls and physical characteristics of bones and joints and so on, many animals, mammals, share many similar characteristics, there is something about human beings that animals never have, never will have, and that is the spirit, right? Which is why we spent so much time on the body, soul, and spirit. So evolution has two main problems, and I'm out of time. And I didn't get to the last one. So the first one was the diversity and complexity of life, but the second part is where all this came from in the first place. And as we saw, evolution has zero answers when it comes to, well, how did we get life in the first place from non-life? And I've got a slide ahead. I'll give you a preview, and we'll have to finish looking at a few of these next week and then get to the 7 Earths model, because we are going to transition now from beginnings to in the end. Remember, this class is called In the Beginning, In the End. And so in the middle, we're going to show the earth and the states of the earth over what the Bible describes from the very beginning to the very end. If you remember, in week 2, I showed you a little model, gave you a glimpse of the 7 Earths model. So we'll talk about that. And then once we understand that, we'll talk about some of the details and some of the prophecy that God gives us for the end of the age, which is one of my favorite subjects to talk about. So that's where we're going. But we'll answer this last question next week. I thought I could get it done and squeeze it all in, but wasn't able to do it. So I'm out of time, and it's 9 o'clock. See, we should go to 9 o'clock every week. We'll just order Chick-fil-A in and some caffeine and coffee, and because we got too much. Did you guys learn something tonight? Isn't this cool? Do you think you can, I mean, just use some of this to anchor yourself in the truth that God made the species? You know, I got a slide at the end that says, we've answered the question, what came first, the chicken or the egg? We know the answer, the chicken. God made the chicken. We know the answer to that. And the chicken is irreducibly complex as well as a whole. So Father, we thank you for these truths and your design. It declares your glory, as you say in Romans 1, as we look to the skies, as we look at Bacterial Flagellum, as we look at all these biological systems that are so, it's so apparent that they are designed in so many ways. I remember lying in bed when Julie was pregnant with our first child, reading this week by week book and all the things that were going on in the bodies and in the womb and in the development and so on. And I remember thinking about halfway through, how can anybody believe this is all just random? Because it is just so designed in so many ways, Lord. And yet this doesn't seem to be defended anymore in the church. I'll show some slides that talk about church leaders talking about how evolution is just a side argument and it's not important, and you can believe in evolution if you want. Lord, I believe you created all things, and I believe it is important that we understand that you are the creator and the giver of life. So help us understand that. Pray in your name, Lord. And all God's people said, amen. Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you. Good. Next week, 7 Earths and the plan for the end of the age. How many of you have taken my end times class, by the way? I know a few of you. All right, good review for you then. Zoom folks, thank you. I'm going to end the recording first.